It's a long story, but I'll hope you take the time to hear what I have to say. I was never good at making friends. My parents died when I was young, a horrible car crash. My father was decapitated and my mother impaled by a set of 24 rebar poles after a construction truck hit it head on. The event left me secluded from the rest of the world. I couldn't interact with others no matter how hard I had tried, and it brought me to the brink of what I was sure was pure insanity. Then one day, as I was contemplating whether or not to cut my wrists in the bathroom when I got home, he showed up. His name was Kyle. From that point on, Kyle and I became best of friends. We would go on to hang out on weekends, talk, and even get jobs in the same hospital. My life was turning around, and thanks to Kyle, I'd begin to open up to the world little by little. Eventually, I met a sweet girl and fell in love. We got married, made love, and had a kid. I was getting what seemed like promotions and raises every day. The best part was that, in the beginning, I only had to come in 2 or so days a week. Everything was well. Then one day, as I was chatting up with Kyle, I recommended that he come over to meet my wife. He was hesitant, but I forced the matter and the date was set for him to join us for dinner. The night I brought him over and introduced him, my wife had a perplexed grin on her face and said nothing to him the whole way through supper. When we were done, Kyle thanked my wife awkwardly for the meal, but instead of answering him, she continued to look at me, almost as if I had betrayed her. My son was also crying from his crib in the other room, which made the whole exchange very unsettling. I whispered to my wife that she should have been a little more hospitable and proceeded to see my friend out. Walking Kyle to his car, he told me he had a wonderful time, but just as he was about to leave, he looked me straight in the eye. With a tone of sorrow, he said, "I'm sorry, you really shouldn't have done that." Started his car and drove off. Since then, I could feel my wife getting further away from me, distant. Sometimes she would completely ignore me whenever I was talking, while other times she would just leave mid-sentence. Hours at my office began to get tougher, and after a while, it got to the point where I had to essentially live there in order to deal with my deadlines. To make matters worse, the office was also downsizing, and I got moved into a small room with no windows and one door. But even then, I still loved my job. I continued my daily chats with Kyle, but once in a while, people would peek into my room. Through the window in my office door, I would see 4 or 5 people in white jackets every day. The routine was always the same. They would look into me talking to Kyle, check something off on their notebooks, and scamper off. I questioned Kyle about them, but he told me to pay them no mind. He looked at me with a sullen face, shook it off, and we continued about our conversation, which was about how well my life was going. After a couple of weeks of these chats, Kyle came to my office and told me that he would be going on a very long trip, and that we would have to put a hold on our conversations. When I asked when he might be back, he shook his head and said he wasn't quite sure, and then left. Then one day, I awoke to a room I had never seen before. The walls around me were made of concrete, there were no windows, and the only objects in the room were a bed, desk, and heavy metal door. I screamed and screamed for someone to come and get me out, and eventually, a person showed up. I recognized him as one of the people who often looked at me in my office. I saw him rush over to the window and the door, proclaiming of someone who had come through with a sort of breakthrough. I asked how long I'd been in here and for him to release me immediately, He looked at me and said I would finally have a chance of leaving this place for the first time in 4 years if my meds kept up. I had been insane. Surely this wasn't possible, but then I realized what must have happened. Kyle. After everything I'd been through, only to find out that my best friend had been a figment of my imagination. I was destroyed. Over time, however, the idea of my situation slowly fell into place in my mind. I learned that I'd been seeing help for my problem only 2 to 3 days a week, before I was pulled into full-time care so that the medical professionals could evaluate my condition more thoroughly, and that I never really had a job at the hospital office. Within the month, I was ready to go home. All of the doctors lined the hall towards the exit and clapped for me on the day I was finally released. I was tired but satisfied. If there was anything that had allowed me to keep myself together over the past few weeks, it had been the idea of finally being able to see my wife and kid again. And as I walked towards the door, it was all I could think about. Then, just as I got to the end of the hall, a familiar face held open the door for me. There, with his trademark grin, was Kyle. I cut my trip short as soon as I heard they were going to release you. I couldn't miss my star patient's release now, could I? I bet you are so glad that you won't have to chat with me ever again. I screamed. I ran home as fast as I possibly could, several times tripping over my own feet. I finally got to my house just as I remembered it. I dashed across the lawn and threw open the door, only to be greeted by nothing. Within time, I learned that my family had been the ones who never existed, and that Kyle, while real, was nothing more than a doctor to me. I found out that I was once again alone. If there were a message to be learned behind all of this, it would be that perspective and conformity aren't all that they are cracked up to be. As the blood flows out of my body and onto the floor of my shower, I'm surrounded by a thick, dead air of loneliness. Is it really right to cure patients' mental dysfunctions? Take them away from a surreal world to place them in this one? Do doctors have the right to do so? As I type these last words with my blood on the fingertips, I don't believe they do. Because if it were up to me, I wish I was still mad.